today, many are commemorating the atrocities that were uncovered in Irpin and Bucha. And I think it is appropriate that we remember them, but also to talk about the war crimes and atrocities in Crimea. And I would ask that we have a moment of silence for all those victims. Thank you. General Breedlove, when he talks about the war, he uses the acronym DIME. I guess this is something he uses in his classes. And it stands for the different silos of war or hybrid war, and that is diplomacy, information, military, and economics. So we will not talk about the other three parts of this acronym, but perhaps to say that diplomatically, I think it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of how well we're doing. I think it is generally agreed upon that we need to be stronger in our messaging about why Ukraine is important to the West. Economics also, that is not a topic for today. I think there's discussions about the role of sanctions and have they really done enough, and have they been like perhaps on the military side where we have been giving Ukraine military support, but sort of drip by drip. And so sometimes when they actually finally arrive, they don't have the maximum value that they could have. It could be said that since the war is not going well for Putin militarily, he has more than intensified to a large scale the information and propaganda part of the war. We have seen that. And it's interesting, there was a Washington Post editorial just yesterday that talked about how effective and how what an important part of warfare disinformation can be. And they have the case study about the things that started 22 years ago when after 9/11, the Ukrainians asked the U.S. to help them secure their labs that had biomaterial. And that's been sort of an ongoing disinformation propaganda that lasts till today, accusing the U.S. that they are using Ukrainian labs to produce bio weapons. There are other parts of the information and propaganda that I think have taken hold that we're seeing it's manifest in different ways. One being the blank check. Well, Ukraine has not asked for a blank check, and it's the role of our Congress to make sure that the check that is written has oversight. And certainly recent DOD analysis and investigations have shown that Ukraine has been using them not only effectively, but strategically even more than what we knew about some of these weapon systems. Another part of the propaganda, which I think is most egregious, is the whole issue of Crimea. It seems that forever people have been pushing the idea that, let Russia have Crimea to get, pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table, and perhaps that one of the prices for peace would be giving Crimea and maybe parts of Eastern Ukraine as the price for peace. I think General Hodges has said that anybody with a high school education and looking at the map would understand what a fallacy that is. Several weeks ago, we had a webinar that talked about the importance of Ukraine retaining Crimea for national security purposes, not only for itself, but certainly for even countries in the Black Sea, whether it's Romania or Turkey, which are NATO countries. but also economically. There is no way that Ukraine will be able to recover economically if it doesn't have control of its ports and access to the Black Sea. So, but besides those reasons why Crimea should always be a part of Ukraine, we need to remember the war crimes and atrocities that have been taking place in Crimea, certainly on a much larger scale since the war began in 2014. You know, we had to wait until the end of World War II to really fully appreciate the extent of the crimes and horrors of the Nazis in Germany and other places. But in Ukraine, we are seeing in real time the atrocities, the mass graves in places like Bucha and Irpin. We do also have some information about what's going on in Crimea, not the full extent. And probably we will not be able to have knowledge of the extent of them until Crimea is liberated and back within Ukraine's control. But it is important that we remember and acknowledge why Crimea is important and should not in any way be given or gifted to Putin based on the war crimes that he has been committing in Crimea. That is the main topic for today's discussion. And we have an expert panel discussants to do this. Unfortunately, one of our key participants, Paul Goble, is not able to join us. He had a medical procedure that is taking a little bit longer than he had anticipated, and so he will be sorely missed. But we have three people who will more than adequately cover the ground, and so I am very happy to present first Maria Tomak. She is the head of the Crimean Platform Department out of the President's office. And then we have David Kramer, who is the executive director for the George W. Bush Institute. He's also board chairman of the Free Russia Foundation and former assistant secretary for democracy, human rights, and labor. And finally, Katerina Shunkaruk, sorry. I sometimes have a hard time with Ukrainian names, can you believe it? She is a political analyst and scholar for international politics covering Ukraine and Eastern Europe at the Bush School of Government and Public Service here in Washington, D.C. I thank you all for taking time to engage in this very important discussion. I first am going to ask Maria to talk about what is happening currently with the Crimean platform and what are the issues, current issues that you see are priorities for us in the international community to be aware of and to focus on. Maria.
Madam Moderator, distinguished panels, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this event. It's great that Crimea has been attracting lots of attention at the various U.S. media and discussion platforms recently. And I think that it's not accidentally, because after Kherson was liberated by Ukrainian army, I think that there has been appeared this feeling and this belief or understanding that Ukraine is actually able to liberate Crimea in the nearest time. So I think it's very important now to talk about Crimea more, to understand it more, and to get rid of those Russian myths that have been there throughout years, decades, and maybe even centuries sometimes. So currently I represent the mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea, but before that, since 2014, I worked a lot as a human rights defender, and I was involved in this work of documenting human rights violations. And I was in Crimea actually when the war started in 2014, in February 2014, several times, also in March of 2014. And I can say that indeed, as it was written in the announcement for this event, not just the war had started in Crimea in 2014, but also all those atrocities that we can see now in mainland Ukraine have also started there. and also in Donetsk and Luhansk region, also in 2014. So therefore, actually, of course, the scales are different, but in essence, Russia continues to do what it has been doing since 2014 at least. But if we take the colonial practices, we understand also that it started several centuries ago, at least. So, and I mean, just to illustrate that, I think that there is one of the very important issues are deportation of children. And as we all know, ICC just issued a warrant arrest for Vladimir Putin and one of his allies, so to say, or people who works within the government. And it's related precisely to the issue of deportation of children. But again, it did not start just now. It started in Crimea in 2014. And it started with the forceful passportization of Ukrainian citizens in Crimea. And those children who have been residing in like orphanages or other institutions, they had no choice at all. Therefore, Russian Federation just imposed its citizenship to those children and immediately started the process of their adoption by the Russian citizens. And I can just cite some numbers. So as of 1st January of 2014, there were 4,323 children, orphans and children deprived of parental care in Crimea, according to the Ministry of Social Policies of Ukraine. And only 6 of those children, after the beginning of the occupation, were shifted, or moved to mainland Ukraine. So the rest of the children, it's even impossible for Ukraine to find their traces, to find their whereabouts. And Ukrainian MFA multiple times addressed Russian Federation to provide Ukraine, first of all, to return to Ukraine our children, but then just to provide at least the information about them. And there was no answer whatsoever about that. So my point is that this practice actually, probably genocidal practice. I don't want to speculate about that because, I understand that it's a legal term and we have to be careful about it, but probably, in essence, this genocidal practice has started in 2014 as well. Now, of course, I don't think that I should go through all the human rights violations that are taking place in Crimea, because I believe that anyone can read, for instance, UNGA resolutions on human rights situation in Crimea, which are adopted annually since 2015, and that clearly and quite objectively state, list all the key problems with human rights violations. But I would like to say that those violations boil down to several processes, like very destructive processes that has been there in Crimea since 2014. First one is the colonization of Crimea. It's the process when essentially like all the non-loyal population has been kind of squeezed out from Crimea. And it just officially, we have 52,000 IDPs. We had prior to the full-scale invasion, 52,000 IDPs from Crimea. But the number in reality is at least double. Is at least 100,000 people. And what made people flee is quite obvious. It's all those violations: political persecutions, torture, suppression of media, discrimination of Crimean Tatars, etc., enforced disappearances, conscription, forced conscription. 16 conscription campaigns were undertaken throughout these years in Crimea. So, and in parallel, we had a process when Russia brought their people or created incentives for their citizens to move to Crimea. That's what I mean by saying colonization. And we had at least 500,000. It's something that is acknowledged even publicly and openly by Russian Federation. At least 500,000 people moved to Crimea illegally from the Russian Federation. But this number can be even bigger. And the second process, which is really important, is the militarization of Crimea. And essentially, it's what we have seen on February 24th, the fact that Crimea was used as a springboard for the full-scale invasion, one of the springboards for the full-scale invasion. These conditions were created throughout the years of the occupation. That's why I cannot agree more when Madame Moderator also raised this issue of whether the giving up Crimea to Putin would mean peace. No, it means war, even more war. So it's really important to understand that Crimea has been under the control of Russia throughout 8 years. And what they did, they turned it into a military base. And now the situation in Crimea is obviously even worse than it was before, because after the beginning of the full-scale invasions, new repressive laws were adopted, which are also used in the occupied territories. Of course, the mobilization campaign, which is an awful thing, obviously, that makes people also flee Crimea. I mean, Ukrainian citizens flee Crimea, Crimean Tatars in the first place flee Crimea. So, and of course, Crimea is used now as a hub, I would say, for the illegal transfer of Ukrainian citizens from the newly occupied territories, including children, by the way. So as we now know from various journalism investigations and reports by independent international observers, there are at least 6 places where those children from Kherson region that were taken away from their families and were put there for allegedly for holidays. And now their parents have to take a road like 1,000 kilometers just to pick up their children. So, so the situation got really worse in Crimea after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Now, I would like to say, because you have asked that question about what Ukraine is actually doing, and I think it's important that the president of Ukraine and the Ukrainian government, we all prepare to the deoccupation of Crimea by developing the reintegration strategies. Our vision of how the governance of Crimea is going to look like, what are we going to do, how do we overcome the consequences of the occupation of Crimea, but also the sort of vision of the future of Crimea in terms of economy and infrastructure. And just, I mean, I would not go into details, but maybe I can tell about that more a bit later, just not to take too much of time. But the essence of this new, if you wish, economic vision of Crimea is that Crimea is a Ukrainian like window and door in terms of culture, but in terms of also economy and infrastructure, both to the Mediterraneans, but also to the global south. Crimea, we all know, is a place where indigenous people of Ukraine are living. Crimean Tatars, which is the biggest Muslim community of Ukraine and who are a part of Ukrainian political nation. Crimean Tatars are fighting within Ukrainian army. Crimean Tatars are taking very high positions in the Ukrainian state, not only related to Crimea, but in general. So it's an essential part of Ukraine, and they do support the Ukrainian state at the level, for instance, of Majlis of Crimean Tatars, who is the self-governing body of Crimean Tatars, which is banned and criminalized in the Russian Federation as of now. So, and also, I mean, we understand there are lots of very complicated issues about reintegration of Crimea. Probably one of the most vulnerable is how do we deal with those Russian citizens who came illegally to Crimea after 2014? So our understanding, I mean, we have no, you know, like operational plan in that regard, but we all understand, and that's the position now of Ukrainian state, that these people will have to leave Crimea after it will be deoccupied because they are there illegally. So therefore, they have to leave Crimea. And there are other issues. So what do we do with the judiciary system? So how do we review all those occupying court decisions that has been made? How do we restore the Ukrainian governance, et cetera, et cetera? So that is something that we look in now, understanding that Crimea is really a complicated case, also because Crimea was out of all the reformation processes that have been taking place in Ukraine since 2014. Because lots of good stuff has been done. And now, Crimea will have to catch it up and of course, overcome the consequences of occupation, but also of long-term presence in Crimea structures like Russian Black Sea Fleet that have been there, as you, Ms. Nadia, said, for decades and even longer. So, but I think, just to sum up, I mean, we see that Crimea now catches lots of attention, as I said, indeed. But we see also that this attention made clear how many misunderstanding or manipulations around Crimea is there. You know, you can just recall that tweets of Elon Musk about Khrushchev and all that stuff, which is totally just not corresponding with his truth that is in the history books. I mean, so Crimea is indeed belongs to Ukraine, not because Ukraine, you know, is the state that wants to grab more land. No, Crimea is linked naturally to Ukrainian mainland, unlike Russia. And now it's clear that the Crimean, so-called Crimean bridge cannot help that. I mean, they cannot serve these purposes of interlink with Russian Federation, as Ukraine has this land interlink with Crimea, and it provided this connection between Crimea and Ukraine for centuries. It was trade, economy, like people were interacting, etc., etc. So, but also I think that the very important argument is the position of indigenous people of Ukraine, Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatars recognized as indigenous people of Ukraine by the law that was introduced, that was initiated by the president of Ukraine. Now we're working upon the special law on the status of Crimean Tatars that would even like expand on that rights of Crimean Tatar people within, I mean, in Crimea and within Ukrainian state. And I think that this legitimacy is really important. And the fact that leaders of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people and lots of Crimean Tatars are currently they flee to mainland Ukraine, and they indeed support Ukrainian state. And that is very important, also one of the very important preconditions for the occupation of Crimea and for the successful reintegration in the future. I would stop here, and I would be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Nadia, thank you. There is so much that you have tried to convey, and I think probably this whole question of even the demographics would require, I think, a separate discussion. You know, Paul Goble wrote, I think, recently about the disproportionate number of Crimean Tatars that are being recruited or drafted or conscripted into the military. I think what you say, we know that the indigenous people, Crimean Tatars, have been Ukrainian patriots. And I think this is why we're seeing the mass deportation and also the importation of, as you say, Russian citizens, because they're trying to break down the Crimean Tatar support, within Ukraine. Thank you for bringing all that. I have to, I guess, just mention, since you talked about the children, kidnapped children. In January, we launched a advocacy informational campaign on this whole issue because we again felt that there was little attention being paid to it. Now, since the Yale report came out, we're seeing a lot more. But just for everybody's information, on April the 27th, we are organizing a roundtable and a plan to for action here in Washington, D.C., where we want to bring together major policy centers, Washington, things that are going on in the UN, the EU, and of course in Ukraine, to really dive deeper into this whole issue of the kidnapped children and also civilian women that have been kidnapped and tortured. So this is something that we are very much engaged in and look forward to working with you perhaps on this. Next, going to turn to David. David, from his whole career, has been focused on human rights, democracy, and with his rich experience, the perfect person to talk about really the overall crimes of Putin regarding human rights, not only in Crimea, but really more broadly, what's going on in other parts of the world. David, I turn it over to you.
Nadia, thanks very much. And it's great to be with you and the fellow panelists on this important conversation. There are 5 acts that would constitute genocide from the Genocide Convention adopted in 1948, I believe it was. And let me just cite what they are. Killing members of a group. Russia seems to be guilty of that. Causing them serious bodily or mental harm, I would say guilty on that. Imposing living conditions intended to destroy the group. I think you could make a case for that as well. Preventing births. They seem to be targeting hospitals and maternity wards. And then forcibly transferring children out of the group. And that is the indictment that has been brought by the ICC against Putin and, ironically, the ombudswoman for children's rights in Russia, who herself, by the way, has taken in a Ukrainian child who was forcibly deported to Russia. So she is not only guilty in her official capacity, I would argue, we'll wait for a court to determine that, but guilty in her personal capacity as well, as someone who is engaged in this kind of behavior. But the 5 acts that I read off, it seems to me Russia is guilty of all of them. And so if I have a regret about the ICC indictment, it is that it is limited and what it is alleging that Putin and she have been accused of. But we all have seen the horrific scenes from Bucha, from Mariupol, from other cities and towns in Ukraine, reports of Russian forces carrying out a deliberate policy of raping Ukrainian women and children, of executing Ukrainian males, having these acts done in front of their families. This is savage, barbaric behavior. I wish I could say it is the first time Russian forces have done this. Of course, it isn't. You look at what Russian forces did in the 2 wars in Chechnya, 94 to 96, and then, of course, again, the 99 reinvasion of Chechnya that launched Putin's political career, and the leveling of Grozny. We hear about the leveling of Ukrainian cities by Russians. Again, there is precedent for this. You look at the Russian intervention in Syria, where the Russians leveled Aleppo. This is standard practice for Russian forces. And so we shouldn't conclude that this is aberrant behavior by Russian forces, whether it's the full military or the Prigozhin Wagner forces. This is standard operating procedure, unfortunately, and it is a reflection of the lack of value that these forces attach to human life, the lack of value that Putin and the Kremlin attach to human life, of course, unless, of course, it's their own lives. We see this in the crackdown inside Russia. Last night on the PBS NewsHour, Zhenya Kara-Murza, the wife of Vladimir Kara-Murza, was on describing how the situation inside Russia has gotten so bad. And this is a reminder, I think, that if we needed one, the way these kinds of regimes treat their own people is often indicative of how they'll behave in foreign policy. And so when they lock up Vladimir Kara-Murza, when they poison an Alexei Navalny, and they poisoned Kara-Murza twice as well, when they shoot and kill Boris Nemtsov yards from the Kremlin, when they shoot and kill Anna Politkovskaya, when they use radioactive substances outside of Russia to murder Alexander Litvinenko and others, they don't attach any value to their own citizens. And so we shouldn't be shocked that they don't attach any value to the lives of Ukrainians. We shouldn't be shocked that they don't attach any value to the concepts of sovereignty and territorial integrity, that they don't respect the independence of Ukraine or Moldova or Belarus or Georgia or any other state in the region. This is, sadly, for those who are directly affected by this, par for the course, the kind of behavior that the Putin regime engages in: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And so based on all of that, Ukraine tragically has been the victim, as Maria pointed out, not just in the past year, but since 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine. And there were more than 14,000 Ukrainians who died between 2014 and last February's invasion. So for those who think, well, it was a minor thing, it was just an annexation, albeit illegal, of Crimea, it was an incursion, it was separatist forces. First of all, they weren't separatist forces. This was fomented from the outside. This was Russian instigated. There was no separatist movement in Ukraine before, including in Crimea. This was all done by Moscow, orchestrated, manufactured by Moscow. Let's remember that in the 91 referendum, 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence, but 90% of the entire country of Ukraine in those borders, that's a lot of people in the East and in Crimea as well. And so it's important to understand that there was no desire to leave Ukraine. People in Crimea, this was true in a lot of places, weren't all that thrilled with the government in Kyiv, but they weren't, and I was there in 2010, I didn't sense any desire to be taken over by Russia. I actually recall hearing a lot of complaints about the construction of apartment buildings in Crimea done by the wife of the former mayor of Moscow, Baturina. And the feeling was that they would be treated as second-class citizens with this kind of development. And in the Donbas region, I wasn't aware of any separatist movement. There was always, I think, a tendency to really exaggerate divisions in Ukraine between East and West. There are divisions in a lot of countries, but not to the point where the eastern part of the country wanted to leave Ukraine, wanted to be taken over by Russia. And the last thing I'll just say is the way, as Maria, I think, so rightly pointed out, the way the citizens in Crimea, the way the citizens in Donbas have been treated by the Russian occupiers has, I think, generated a lot of blowback. We shouldn't be shocked that when Russia invades its neighbors, that tends to repel the people living in these regions rather than bring them on to the side of Moscow. And what we have seen, I would argue, is that Putin, through his invasion in 2014, and then with his reinvasion starting last February 24th, paradoxically has done more to unite Ukrainians than anyone else. And Ukrainians have an incredibly strong sense of identity these days. They are performing tremendously heroically and courageously. They are an inspiration, I think, to everyone around the world. And they are more united and determined that they're going to win. If you look at the surveys that have recently been done, Ukrainians are incredibly confident that they will be victorious, despite the terrible toll that is being inflicted on Ukraine for absolutely no reason whatsoever. And they strongly oppose any territorial concessions. So for those who argue, well, we could find a way to end the war if Ukraine simply made compromises, Ukraine is a democracy. President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader, and he needs to pay attention to the sentiment of the people of Ukraine, and they do not support territorial concessions or compromises. And so for those in the West who keep raising this issue, I wish they would stop denying Ukraine agency in this process. I wish they would listen to Ukrainians and recognize that there is no support inside Ukraine for compromise and territorial concessions. And as Maria pointed out, if the Russians were left in control of Crimea, that would, one, basically approve of Putin's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It would be a launching pad, as she pointed out, for the move into Donbas in 2014. And Crimea would be the place where Russian forces would always be prepared to launch an attack. So we in the West need to stop talking about this and recognize that Crimea is part of Ukraine. And so when we talk about Ukrainian victory, which I think is achievable, that includes regaining control over Crimea as well as every other inch of Ukrainian territory that Russia itself has recognized as part of Ukraine. and previous agreements going back to 91, the 97 Friendship Treaty and other things, Russia has recognized Ukraine's internationally recognized borders that include Crimea, and those who want to sell out Crimea and people living on the peninsula should really stop doing so.
David, thank you for that really comprehensive recalling of the history, which is so important, especially for these people who continue these myths about, Russian speakers wanting to be in Ukraine. What you say about Putin has done more to unite Ukraine. One of his arguments was it was there to defend Russian speakers. Yet who has suffered the most in terms of in Ukraine geographically, where the Russian speakers are concentrated, be it, Donetsk or, Crimea. And, talking a little bit more about Crimea, I think the Kyiv Independent had a story today or yesterday about the filtration efforts that are going on in Crimea, specifically with children. And I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about words are important. And I object to the word filtration, because usually when you filter something, that means you're taking something bad out of whatever you're filtering. We've got to find a better word that describes actually what is taking place, the brainwashing that's going on. And thank you for reminding us about 1991. I think Crimea voted, every oblast voted over 50%, because I think the number was 93. And I think in Crimea, it was close to 60%, and even in Donetsk. So people voted peacefully what direction and where they wanted to be. So thank you again for reminding us. And talking about Ukraine's victory, I think we need to maybe once again make the point that we hear from Ukrainians, and including our military experts, that if we give Ukraine what they need, when they need it, and where they need, that this war could be ended. I think General Hodges has talked about the fact that the war could be over and Ukraine could win by the end of this summer, including freeing Crimea, if we stop this sort of drip by drip giving Ukraine what they need when they need it. So I think some of our military people have said, really, the ball is in our court in terms of helping decide when Ukraine will be victorious. So thank you. Now, Katerina, from your experience and as an activist also, talk to us about, from your perspective, how you see the situation in Crimea. And I think you were interested in talking a little bit about the motivation that you perceive. Katerina?
Yes, thank you, Nadia. It's very hard to add something new to this conversation after these two brilliant presentations by Maria and David. But I will just try to maybe unpack a little bit more this debate that Crimea is a red line for Putin, and that this is something that can create a nuclear incident, for instance, among other claims, and the motivations for Putin's behavior in this war. So just to underscore that he is acting rationally. He is not a savage or insane, but he is his rationality needs to be understood within a specific framework. And this is not a framework of an international actor. It is a framework of a international gangster. Yeah, it's a bully who acts with aggressively towards those who are weaker, and backtracks when sees power and like real pushback. So my point here is that no territorial concessions to Putin will actually satisfy his geopolitical appetite. On the contrary, it is actually only the full defeat that could bring some sustainable security arrangement in Europe in terms of broader security, including security in the Black Sea region, which means that this could only be ensured with Crimea being under Ukraine's control. And just to give you some numbers about how the Putin's war had exposed Russia, you know, as actually a big Potemkin village. That basically the Russian appeared to be weaker than most of the Europeans had previously thought. And according to some recent pollings, in comparison between May 22 and January 23, there is a clear drop in numbers across European countries in how they perceive the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And so my point here is that given all this weakness that Russia has been exposed with of its military might that appeared also to be a Potemkin village, the only argument that is really left on the table is this type of nuclear blackmail, which increasingly seems to have fewer people that believe it. But unfortunately, he still focuses on the West and specifically President Biden's administration as the main target audience for this nuclear blackmailing. And so in my view, it does have to be seen as just, you know, another disinformation campaign, given all the things we know about his mentality of not exposing himself vis-a-vis equal opponents, but only attacking weaker ones. And with Crimea, the main goal for Russia is basically what had already been said. It's militarization and control of the Black Sea. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about possible scenarios. And again, going back to this idea of how well Crimeans would be under Russia, how prosperous Crimea could actually be, what kind of future it will have with Russia. I think it is crystal clear now that it is just being used and exploited for military purposes, and its citizens have no say in its future. And increasingly, you know, with Russia's economic deterioration of the economic situation in Russia, increasingly more this will be affecting residents of Crimea. So basically, from the humanitarian perspective and from the security perspective, it is clear that Ukraine will have more to offer to Crimea. In terms of even like the prospect of becoming EU member one day. And in terms of this discussion about identity of Crimeans, which is a peninsula identity, we should be saying that, you know, it's not about Ukrainian ethnic identity we are talking now. We are talking about Ukrainian civic identity, you know, who is a Ukrainian citizen. And this is clear now that citizenship can have all kinds of, you know, ethnic components, not only Crimean Tatars, but also people from Russia who, I mean, Russian descent, who can act and be Ukrainian nationals. So this is, and of course, I agree that there has to be, with Maria, that there has to be a very sensitive and sensible policy towards the complete change of Crimean population after illegal annexation of 2014. And so basically, when we are talking about the future of Crimea, the only sustainable arrangement in terms of its economy, in terms of its connection to Ukraine's mainland, in terms of broader geopolitical security in the Black Sea, all these things point to Crimea being better off with Ukraine. Now, should it be an immediate solution, or should there be some kind of delayed diplomatic arrangement? And so this is a question that also is being broadly discussed with, considering different options. One thing I would like to underscore here, that again, from the humanitarian perspective, the sooner Crimea returns to Ukraine, the better for its people, for its infrastructure, for everything. And the tactics that Russia has been using towards Crimea has been by the KGB book. It was first, it was honeymoon with lots of investments, with trying to create some kind of exemplary case as opposed to Crimea being quote unquote overlooked within Ukraine. And then very soon it became neglected, its citizens treated as second class, and eventually now drafted for this war, exploited just as a resource for further aggression. It reminds me, it makes me draw a very sad parallel with Mariupol, with how how Mariupol looked in Ukraine with all the investments that were made there to actually rebuild the city, and what it looks now. And this is the signature style of Russia. So this is definitely not a promising future for Crimea if it stays within Russia further. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So, David, I know that you have a hard stop at 11. So I'm going to ask you the question, the whole issue of nuclear weapons, the threat that Putin continues to try to uses, right, to deter us from giving Ukraine, I think, what it needs. I'd like to have you talk about your view about this. Obviously, it is a serious issue, but I have to recall that in 1990 and 91, when the breakup of the Soviet Union was, taking place, the Ukrainian representative to the UN in a meeting here in Washington, a small group meeting, said that if Ukraine became independent, there would be nuclear chaos in the world. So this nuclear issue has been used for a long time. But talk about it in terms of today, what is happening today on this discussion.
Sure. Well, it's important to remember that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus, along with Russia, inherited nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had. And there was a campaign to encourage those three countries to return or to send those nuclear weapons to Russia so that Russia would be the central holder of these weapons. That was then codified in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 for Ukraine, where the United States, the UK, Russia, and Ukraine agreed that in exchange for Ukraine's sending their nuclear weapons to Russia, those other three countries would respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and would not take any military measures against Ukraine. It was, and this gets a little bogged down in semantics, it was a memorandum, it wasn't a treaty, but nevertheless, what Ukraine did was historic. It was a country that inherited nuclear weapons and then decided under some pressure from the United States in particular to surrender those weapons to Russia. I know in some circles in Ukraine, there is resentment over this, the feeling that if Ukraine had kept those weapons, Russia would never have invaded, going back to 2014. That said, what's happening now is Putin, as you said, Nadia, is nuclear saber rattling, and he is trying to scare us, trying to get us to back off on our assistance to Ukraine, because he wants to create this image here that if we continue to provide assistance for Ukraine, Ukraine continues to succeed militarily, that Putin might use a nuclear weapon. I think the chances of that are extraordinarily low. And I think even if Putin decided to order a launch of nuclear weapons, that the Russian generals would not go along with it. It wouldn't provide an advantage to Russia militarily. It could as likely kill as many Russians as it would Ukrainians. Not that Putin really cares about that. It wouldn't make it wouldn't help Russia on the battlefield. And saying he's going to place tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, he is essentially undoing everything that was done in the early 1990s by providing those nuclear weapons there. Lukashenko is a willing accomplice to Putin. Let's remember that he allowed Russian forces to use Belarusian territory to launch the invasion last February. Russia has used Belarus territory for launching airstrikes and other missile attacks against Ukraine. And it's important to keep in mind, Lukashenko has done this, not the people of Belarus. It seems pretty clear that the people of Belarus do not support the war. There have even been efforts of sabotaging Russian aircraft and rail lines that run through Belarus. And Lukashenko has resisted mobilizing his military to join Russian forces in the campaign, because I think even he is aware that if he did so, the blowback among the Belarus population would be significant. So we shouldn't fall for this trap of Putin's trying to use nuclear weapons to scare us, to intimidate us. He is inflicting terrible damage, terrible harm and death and destruction on Ukraine without using tactical nuclear weapons. And we should realize that if he crossed that threshold, I think he would lose Chinese support. The Indians would be incredibly unhappy given their relationship with Pakistan. And no one wants to see the quote unquote normalization of use of tactical nuclear weapons. And I think even Putin might understand that.
So David, before we let you go, you mentioned the word China. So, you know, a part of the, I guess, propaganda going on in this country is we've got to pay attention to China. Talk a little bit about, if you really care about China, you should care that Ukraine win.
Yeah, there is a school of thought in the United States that says we are taking our eye off the target, if you will. That Ukraine and Russia are a distraction from what should be our focus, which is China. Utter nonsense. Let's bear in mind that no one is watching the situation unfold between Russia and Ukraine more than President Xi. And he is calculating what the reaction of the international community is, of what the West in particular, the steps that we have taken with sanctions, the military assistance we have provided Ukraine, the bolstering of defense of countries in the region. He is watching very carefully how we respond to this. So if we, the United States, want to deter and discourage President Xi from moving against Taiwan, then the best way we can do that is to help Ukraine. Because if President Xi sees our response to Ukraine, then he will also think we'll do the same for Taiwan. These two cases are not obviously completely comparable, but the best way we can deal with the threat from Beijing is to help Ukraine win. And so I really think that those who argue, let's stop providing this assistance, let's focus on the threat in the Pacific and the East, are completely missing. Let's also remember, Europe was the origin of 2 world wars in the last century. So what happens in Europe has global implications. The other part of this, of course, is Russia's blocking of Ukrainian agricultural and food exports was creating a global food crisis. Russia's use of energy contributed to the inflation problems that we all face. This is a global crisis. This is the biggest crisis the international community has faced since World War II. It's not just a Ukraine problem. It's not just a Europe problem. This is a global problem, which means it's our problem. And the least we can do in the United States and the rest of Europe, and I say deliberately the rest of Europe, recognizing that Ukraine is part of Europe, but the least we can do in the United States, Canada, Australia, South Korea, Japan, and others, along with the rest of Europe, is to provide Ukraine with the means to win. Ukrainians aren't asking us to send our troops to fight on the ground for them. They are doing a heroic job of fighting this, led by President Zelensky. The least we can do is to give them the arms to do so. And by the way, and I am confident Ukrainians will win, this will be for us, not for Ukraine, who have paid a terrible price, but for us, the least expensive way of defeating one of the greatest authoritarian threats out there. The Ukrainians are basically doing our job for us, and the least we can do is to help them. Their fight for freedom is our fight for freedom, and we need to recognize that and rally around behind them. So I do apologize, Maria and Katerina. Thank you for letting me be part of your discussion here today. Nadia, always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, and Slava Ukraina.
And I'm sorry, David, thank you again for that really eloquent discussion about the nature of the importance of Ukraine. And regarding even China, we should also be cognizant about the fact that China has been trying to, or has been actually in Ukraine, grabbing intellectual property. They understand the value of Ukraine's in so many ways. And if we care about our competition with China, then we should make sure that Ukraine remains in our orbit. So, David, thank you again so much. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. And we will continue for a few more minutes. Thank you. You know, Katerina, you mentioned something about citizenship, Ukrainian citizenship. I have to mention that we began working in Ukraine in 1990 and worked with Ruch, the movement, and they were, I think, one of the most strategic organizations I have seen in Ukraine since then till now. They basically taught us Americans to talk about the people of Ukraine, because they were very cognizant of the fact that Ukraine was the home for, 100 some different ethnic groups. So in their leadership council, they had representatives of the different major ethnic groups. There was a Russian there, Crimean Tatar, you know, so the major ethnic groups were part of the leadership of Ruch. And also talking about the nuclear issue, just an added footnote to what David was talking about. You know, the declaration from Ruch and the declaration of sovereignty that the Rada passed in August of 91 talked about Ukrainian want to be nuclear free. And so it wasn't that Ukraine needed to be pushed to give up nuclear weapons. What they did object to, giving them to Russia. That was the major point of contention on that issue. And boy, were the Ukrainians right about that. So I'm sorry, I just had to add a few other things. Katerina, did you want to say something?
Yes, if I may, I would just add something here on this specific note that, you know, there is a part of Russia's disinformation campaign is that, you know, Crimea was almost unlawfully given to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954, and Russia was like just returning what it belongs to Russia originally. But this is very, I would say, very, very stretched interpretation, because from the legal perspective, not only did Russia recognize eventually Ukraine within its 1991 borders, but the problem of Crimea and specifically the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol had come up immediately after Ukraine declared its independence. And so my point here is that when Russia signed in 1994 Budapest Memorandum, providing Ukraine with assurances of its territorial integrity in exchange for giving up the third world largest nuclear potential, Russia was completely conscious of recognizing Crimea as part of Ukraine in this memorandum including. So there is no way they can claim that there was a historical injustice that they were looking forward to address and in 2014.
Yes, and thank you, Katerina. You're absolutely right. However, I guess we have to acknowledge that I don't think Russia ever feels compelled to adhere to agreements that it signed. So I'm sure when they were signing it, their intentions towards Crimea, have remained the same. They've wanted to have control of that peninsula from, decades ago, and certainly even from independence moving forward. I do think we have a few questions. As a Crimean Tatar, I'm happy to hear that Ukrainian government is paying close attention to Crimean Tatars' role in Ukraine's attempt to regain Crimea. This was not always the case when Crimea was part of Ukraine from 1990 till 2014. Ukraine basically ignored Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of Crimea. Is Ukraine now ready to offer Crimean Tatars their territorial autonomy within Ukraine? What plans does Zelensky government have for a Crimean Tatar autonomy?
So I'll pick up this one. Thank you for this important question. And I cannot agree with you more on the fact that Ukraine, as a Ukrainian state, was not paying enough attention to Crimea, and not the proper attention, not in a proper way, especially to Crimean Tatars who tried to go back to their homeland. And they did not face the support, but rather some obstacles to be back. So, and I think that now what Ukraine is doing as a state, which has lots of people of other kinds, I would say, coming to the cabinets of various levels at the government, in the parliament, etc., is to work upon those mistakes. And those legal initiatives that I quoted, that I mentioned, is a part of that effort. Now, when it comes to the issue of the status of Crimea within the Ukrainian state, it is something that should be written in the constitution of Ukraine. Now, when we have the martial law related to the facts of the large-scale aggression, we cannot make changes into the constitution of Ukraine. It's just not possible technically. But what we do now is, with this legislation that I mentioned, precisely with the legislation on the status of Crimean Tatar people, we're working upon this law. I mean, it's already done, but it's not yet registered in the parliament. So we worked upon it together with Majlis of Crimean Tatar people, with experts, and with the members of the parliament. So the aim of this law is introduce as much as it's possible within the martial law circumstances for the Crimean Tatar people. So, and the issue of the status of Crimea is something that will be decided, legally, after the war is over. And I'm not going to, to tell you that this issue not requires some work, but also with the public opinion, explaining to people, what does it mean? What do we mean by the territorial autonomy? What should it mean for Crimean Tatars? What should it mean for Crimea, for Ukraine in general? So that is something that this work that should be done. But I also can say on my own behalf, as a citizen of Ukraine, I'm not representing now the position of the government because I am not authorized to do that in that particular issue. But I totally agree that there should be territorial autonomy for Crimean Tatars in Crimea. Also because, this issue has not yet also been discussed within Ukrainian state, but maybe that is something that we need to go through these discussions inside the country. But I mean, I will say that because you are asking this question and you are a Crimean Tatar yourself, and I really respect that. So we have to acknowledge, it's the process when we have to acknowledge, I mean, Ukrainians have to acknowledge that as a part of the Russian Empire and as a Soviet Empire, Ukrainians were also a part of that colonial power as well, because Ukrainians were also coming to Crimea as a part of this empire, of the Russian Empire and then Soviet Empire. And when you understand that, when you acknowledge that, when you really understand the history of Crimea and these developments of the previous centuries, personally, me as a citizen of Ukraine, I have no doubt that Crimean Tatars have to be provided with the territorial autonomy. But I will repeat that this work have to be done by us inside Ukraine to reach this consensus within the Ukrainian society and this understanding why it's important and why it's absolutely natural. Thank you.
Maria, did you have some other things that you wanted to cover? I see something in the chat room. If not, there's a question about what do officials know about the economic conditions in Crimea under Russian occupation? Maria, do you want to?
Yes, I mean, of course, it's important to underline that Crimea is isolated and it's extremely complicated to get any proved information from the peninsula. We are in touch with our citizens in Crimea. We can grab this understanding of what's going on in the field, you know, with this people-to-people contact, person-to-person contacts, but that not provide us, you know, the statistics, this overall picture of what's going on. But Crimea has been under the sanctions throughout all these years. Crimean ports are closed. I mean, the situation is not good there. And as Ms. Katarina said, you know, there was this time when, for some people who benefited from the occupation, I mean, for instance, the retired officers of the Russian army who inhabited Sevastopol and surroundings. So, but now, I mean, for many people, it's clear that Crimea is in the middle of nowhere. And and of course, as a land which is controlled by the Russian Federation, all of this stuff that is caused by the sanctions, which, to my opinion, is really effective. So that all covers Crimea as well. But I mean, I think that the main argument here, of course, is that people in Crimea are living in the military base. It's not a good life.
I would like to jump in really quickly here just to say that for those Crimeans residents who stayed in, who resided there before 2014 annexation and are still there through 2022, 2023, there's definitely a huge shock. This invasion had been, even with all the media campaign, with all the brainwashing, it is different how these people see Russia's invasion as opposed to residents of other Russia's provinces. And especially that they have this people-to-people connections. Many have families in Ukraine, many travel to Kherson very often. So this is something that also makes Crimea different, and in some way like more vulnerable, but in other ways more open to hear the truth about Russia and its goals and policies.
If I may also, sorry, this question was, I mean, it was addressed to David, but I would like to really briefly comment on the issue of Donbas, because I think that, again, it's something that really does not add optimism and belief into the international legal also system and just in general international architecture, security architecture and peace architecture, which was of course undermined by Russia, but still. So the fact that Russia invaded Donetsk and Luhansk regions, so that is not a separatism in no way, was recently acknowledged by the European Court for Human Rights. I understand that this institution is not such relevant for the US, but still that is the court institution. And why I'm saying that it makes me a bit pessimistic, because this has not been absorbed by the public opinion as I see it, you know. Still we have some doubts. I can hear all over the place even doubts about this so-called referendum in Crimea under the gunpoint, you know. So I think that it's really important, because that is something that we talked about in the beginning, this informational war, hybrid warfare. Russia was so successful with that even, you know, UNGA resolutions, even the decisions of the court institutions. In Crimean case, it's also International Court of Justice. It's also the ICC, the reports of the General Prosecutor Office who acknowledge that Crimea is occupied, and we cannot speak of any referendums there. So, I mean, even those powerful institutions were not succeeding, were not able to undermine this Russian propaganda and manipulations. So, and I don't have any solutions here. I just wanted to bring this attention that still we sometimes argue about things that are, to my opinion, are set in stone. There's no separatism in Donbas. That was the military operation of Russia, who used some people, you know, with some, you know, alternative opinion, or people who were not satisfied with the government of Ukraine. But I was also, by the way, unsatisfied. That's why I was on Maidan at that point, you know. So I think it's important just to think about it and to acknowledge.
Maria, I think you are absolutely right. This is the part of the ongoing, decades-long propaganda and disinformation about, you know, Russian speakers in Ukraine. Right, they were not separatists. It's a battle that still has to be won. But I think what we're seeing though now, I think the people of Eastern Ukraine, right, are making the case that they may be Russian speakers, but they're citizens of Ukraine and they're defending Ukraine territory, right? And you know, even if they're ethnically Russian, they're citizens of Ukraine, and they might have wanted to have good relations. And we hear about the personal, really, tragedies of now family members, right, who have families in Russia and Ukraine, and they no longer understand each other, right, because when they talk to their relatives in Russia, they're not believed, right? The propaganda has worked so well within Russia. So you have this, you know, families that are now, you know, broken in those respects. So it's a very complex situation, and unfortunately, the Kremlin has taken advantage of it. And you're right, we in the West sometimes don't know enough about really what the situation is before we come to conclusions, which then sometimes can result in wrong policy decisions. I think our time is just about up, or is up. I don't think we have any additional questions. So maybe I'll just, as a final thing, just give each of you, if you want to just say a few concluding words. Maria?
Yes, I think that, thank you so much again for this opportunity. And I think that although, you know, it might sound controversially, because this historical revisionism is something that Putin is trying to do while referring to the history which was made up, which is not the true history. But I think I'm really sure that we need to, in order to really understand why Crimea is Russia, or is not Russia, sorry, and why Crimea should belong to Ukraine, I mean, to be a part of, and why it is a part of Ukraine, we really also need to look in maybe deeper into the history of Crimea, and to understand its connection with mainland Ukraine, to understand those indigenous peoples that have been living in Crimea for centuries. And I think that is a very important thing, because oftentimes I even notice that people who do support territorial integrity of Ukraine, they have doubts about Crimea, like you know, honestly, they have indeed this, not because they're bad or they're Putin's like agents, but indeed. And I think it's all because they don't really go deeper into the situation and don't really understand it. And it is important because it is something that decides actually, will Ukraine be provided with the necessary weapons to deoccupy Crimea or not? So all these discussions are not only about, you know, our perception of history, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about whether Ukraine has this moral right to liberate Crimea or not. And obviously it does, but I think that this understanding sometimes is missing in all these discussions. That's why I thank you for this discussion, for this conversation. And hopefully it will also contribute to this understanding of what's actually the place of Crimea. Thank you.
Yes, Maria, thank you. You're absolutely right. And we're not going to get it done in one discussion or two. This is something I think that we have to continue doing. I think I might have mentioned before the webinar started that we had a webinar focusing on Crimea from the national security perspective and economic perspective. And we now have over 7,000 views because people are sharing and asking, looking for people to view this. So perhaps we will, some of this re-education will be taking place, and hopefully will then result in good policy decisions. You're absolutely right. Crimea must be and is Ukraine. Katerina, would you like to just say some final words, please?
Yes, thank you. Well, it's hard to add something more to this conversation. It has been such a good case about, you know, Crimea being under Ukraine has economic justification, geopolitical security justification, and obviously humanitarian and moral justification. So from every point of view, Crimea under Ukraine is a viable and sustainable solution when we are looking in the opposite scenarios. It will be temporary, just, you know, delayed conflict. So if Ukraine is given all the support it needs to end this conflict now, to actually bring a sustainable solution and restore all its territories of 1991, then Crimea will be just moving forward alongside Ukraine with prospects for more investments, with prospects, as I said, for joining EU. And this moral argument about what is good for the people of Ukraine, well, it is clear, and Crimean Tatars were very vocal about how they see their future, Crimea inside Ukraine. But when it comes to other people, these people with, you know, peninsular mentality who basically just want prosper in their house in Crimea, well, it is also very clear that Russia has very little to offer for them in the future, basically has no future to offer, to be very blunt. And so from the moral and humanitarian perspective, we also see that there is very little alternative that could offer some prospects for Crimeans except leaving Russia and returning to Ukraine. Thank you very much again for organizing these conversations. This is very important.
And Katerina, thank you so much. You have added a lot to this discussion, and I think we will continue maybe on some aspects of some of the things we've discussed today to take a deeper dive. So we hope to see you again sometime soon in some of our next webinars. Thank you very much, ladies, and thank our audience. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.